Hello, everybody. I'm Beth Whittle. I'm the Executive Director of Counseling and School-Based Mental Health Integration at the State Department of Education here in Oklahoma. And I have with me Trisha Goga. She is our fabulous crisis team school psychologist. And today we have for you mental health MTSS as well as crisis implications. So with that, if you didn't see my comment earlier in the chat, if you would please put your role and school district in the chat box for us. That'll help us tailor our presentation to our audience. And we will go ahead and get started. All right. Can everybody see the presentation? Yes, great. All right, so just a few housekeeping things before we get started. The PD certificates will be posted in the chat at the end of the presentation. And if you're watching the recording later, you can email that event's email address right there for your PD certificate following viewing the recorded session, pardon me. And CEUs for licensure are no longer being issued by the State Department. That doesn't mean you can't still secure them, but you will have to send the certificate of attendance or your PD certificate to your respective licensing board for LPC, LMFT, LCSW, whatever license you hold for approval. And then one more quick thing I wanted to direct your attention to, if you're not familiar with Ready Together Oklahoma, this is our not necessarily return to learn initiative, but kind of what does education look like moving forward post-pandemic, and what are some considerations that we need to keep in mind. There are 5 main buckets for Ready Together, with new guidance populated monthly. And one of them is supporting student well-being that has a very SEL focus. So if you haven't checked out Ready Together, I would highly recommend that. All of the documents are there for you to take, distribute. They've been curated with our national expert partners to keep you guys from having to weed through the tons of resources that are out there. We are curating them. So you pretty much have a one-stop shop. Okay, so in this session today, our learning objectives, you will be able to leave with an understanding of how to appropriately structure a menu of interventions with a multi-tiered system of support for mental health. You will learn how to provide options for different interventions, both virtually and in person. And then you'll also learn how to utilize best practice for school crisis management and how to collaborate with community agencies to ensure services are being provided beyond what a school can provide. Okay, so why do we need school-based mental health? Why do we need multi-tiered systems of support for mental health? The Annie E. Casey Foundation ranks Oklahoma in the bottom 10 states in the nation for child well-being, with an overall ranking of, it's actually 48 out of all 50 states, with new data that I received today. Our students are at higher risk for mental health disparities than any other state, according to our Department of Health. And more of our children have witnessed domestic violence than in any other state in the nation. And we do know that that rate has gone up since the pandemic. We also know that nearly 1/3 of our students have experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, which is the highest rate in the country. And if you're not familiar with adverse childhood experiences, it's trauma, chronic stress. So nearly 1/3 of our students have experienced some form of trauma or chronic stress in their lives, which again is the highest rate in the country. So that just exemplifies the importance of having systemic services in place that support mental health at school, because we can meet kids where they're at school. We can ensure that they're receiving certain service deliveries while they're in our care and within our buildings, whereas when they leave, we don't necessarily know if they might make it to that mental health professional session because of transportation issues or whatever have you. So we also know that comprehensive school-based mental health programming in schools has really great outcomes. We see improvements in social and self-awareness, as well as decision-making capacity and relationship skills. So really hitting at those core competencies of social and emotional learning as defined by Castle. We also see better academic outcomes, fewer special education referrals, and a decreased need for restrictive placements. We also see fewer disciplinary actions as well as office discipline referrals. This has been illustrated in data through some of our grant schools with Project Aware, that in instituting comprehensive school-based mental health, MTSS, our office discipline referrals have gone down drastically in our Project Aware districts. And then we also see increased student engagement and feelings of connectedness towards the school, which can be a preventative factor towards future mental health issues or suicidal ideation. Oh, and I would also like to mention, I'm sorry, I skipped a little bit of housekeeping. Dr. Shelley Ellis, our fearless leader in student support, is our moderator, and she's moderating the chat box for us today. So if you have questions pop up as I'm speaking, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I can't see the chat right now. So Dr. Ellis, don't hesitate to interrupt me if one comes up and is timely, as opposed to saving it to the end. Okay, so what is a multi-tiered system of support? You might be familiar with RTI or PBIS, it's the triangle, but a multi-tiered system of support really focuses on that academic and behavior piece together. When you rope in mental health services along with behavior, you're really looking at what's called a true interconnected systems framework, because you're meeting the needs of the whole child at every tier of intervention. So as defined by ESSA, a multi-tiered system of support is a comprehensive continuum of evidence-based, keyword there, evidence-based systemic practices to support a rapid response to students' needs with regular observation to facilitate data-based instructional decision-making. So what is comprehensive school-based mental health? Comprehensive school-based mental health programming provides a full array of supports and services that promote positive school climate, social emotional learning, mental health, and well-being, while reducing the prevalence and severity of mental illness. It's built on a strong foundation of district and school professionals, including administrators and educators, specialized instructional support personnel, such as school psychologists, social workers, counselors, nurses, in strategic partnership with students, families, and community health and mental health partners. I think the most important part of this piece is that multidisciplinary team, really having numerous individuals in multiple roles who bring different perspectives to comprehensive school-based mental health, as well as roping in that, pardon me, that community mental health component. We know in Oklahoma, a lot of our districts are in mental health deserts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that because they don't have a local provider within their area, that they still don't have resources available to them that can be structured within a tiered system of support for mental health. And comprehensive mental health also assesses and addresses the social and environmental factors that impact health and mental health. So this is what a multi-tiered system of support looks like. At the bottom, you have tier 1, that's prevention. And when it comes to school-based mental health, comprehensive school-based mental health, I preach that the focus really needs to be on prevention, and I will talk to that a little bit later. Tricia will talk later about tier 3, and this is where we're meeting the needs of students who have already reached that crisis level, or perhaps their needs can't be met within the classroom or within this school. And then in the middle, that tier 2 area, early intervention, is about 10 to 15% of our student population. And those are for students who might need a little additional support beyond tier 1, but aren't quite in need of intensive supports at tier 3. But what's important to remember about a multi-tiered system of support for any disciplinary area, such as academics, behavior, and mental health, that students flow fluidly through in the tiers. If I'm a student receiving tier 1 services, such as social and emotional learning curriculum, or maybe it's our suicide prevention curriculum, that doesn't mean that I might not also simultaneously need services at tier 2 and tier 3. So again, tier 1, services for all, and then as severity of need goes up, we structure our interventions from there. Okay, so when we think about school-based mental health, I always like to talk about the flipped triangle in regards to MTSS because I think it really paints a really good picture. So if we're focusing on prevention, that means we're meeting the majority of the needs of all of our students regarding mental health. We will have less students at Tier 3 needing that individualized crisis support. If we're not focusing on prevention and we're not giving students those universal supports at Tier 1, that triangle flips. And then we're spending the majority of our time responding to students in crisis. We're spending the majority of our time making outpatient referrals. If you're in the school counselor role, if you think about this from an academic lens, you're spending more time with remediation and less time with core content instruction at Tier 1. So really focusing on those universal supports cuts down the amount of students that might need that more intensive level of support. And one thing I'd also like to touch on, I did already mention moving fluidly through between tiers, but we need to be mindful of the language that we're using when we're talking about students in reference to a tiered system of support. We don't want to say Johnny's a Tier 3 student. As opposed to that, we could say Johnny may need additional support or Johnny's receiving services at Tier 3. So services and supports that are backed by scientific or practice-based evidence are evidence-informed services and supports. And we want to make sure that everything we institute within a comprehensive school-based mental health MTSS are evidence-based. So our teams within our sites need a system to evaluate evidence. Is what we're doing working? Do we need to maybe rethink what we're putting in at Tier 1 if we're still seeing a lot of students in need of services at Tier 3? So we need constant ongoing monitoring of implementation success, as well as systematic, reliable data that informs our decisions for student support services. So some different examples of some different examples of sources of evidence could be evidence-based practice registries, research literature, the developers of those EBPs, or schools that have implemented the service or support in the past. I know if you're thinking about doing a mental health MTSS, we have several partner districts who are doing this phenomenally that already have the EBPs structured at each tier of intervention, and we are happy to make those connections for you. Several of those I'll talk about today, but if you see a gap for your school based on need, we can help thought partner in what intervention might be appropriate at that tier of intervention. So we always want to use data, as I mentioned, to drive our decision-making process. So we can use observations and other data to inform our decision-making process, but it should always be used to make fair and objective decisions, specifically about identifying what mental health needs to be addressed, matching our students to appropriate interventions and supports, because what our qualitative observation is that a student might need might not be exactly what they end up needing to be well. We need a progress monitor to evaluate their response to interventions, as well as changing their services over time as appropriate. Just because I'm receiving private counseling at Tier 3 doesn't mean that that problem will never go away and I always need to receive services at Tier 3. So being mindful of that and adjusting supports as appropriate. And then also making sure that we identify issues related to data sharing, such as HIPAA and FERPA. And then also securing consents and releases of information to allow data sharing between system partners. This is one of the things that I've seen to be very beneficial, specifically for memorandums of understanding between schools and community mental health professionals, to really ensure that us as school professionals are getting the information back from health providers that we need, but ensuring we're doing it under HIPAA and FERPA that keeps us safe.
Beth, we do have a question. How do you decide what scientific or evidence-based practices to use, and where can they find those?
Sure. So that's a great question. And I will get into how to find them and where they're at a little bit later in my presentation. And I will also talk about screening and later in my presentation. And when we screen our students, that really helps us to identify what that target area is and what evidence-based practices we need to select. So I will get into screening and program selection here in just a little bit. And I also have information about where you can get some free evidence-based screeners. Did that cover it? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, and I would also like to mention, as far as HIPAA and FERPA and then securing MOUs with community providers, if mental health MTSS is something that you're wanting to advocate to district leadership, or maybe you are a superintendent or an administrator who's looking at instituting this in your district, we have examples of all of those things that we've used with other districts. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we can help you not have to start by staring at a blank piece of paper. Okay, so some different data sources in schools that we can use are mental health screenings and assessments, school climate surveys, grades, attendance, performance test scores, office discipline referrals, suspensions and expulsions, our different achievement and benchmark test scores, behavioral observations, and our rate of crisis incidents. I will say, if you're looking at figuring out what targeted interventions a student might need at Tier 3, there are different screeners that you would use, but it is best practice to screen the student population that would be being served by these evidence-based practices. Some screeners will give you student level data, and some screeners will give you school climate level data. So if you do choose to use a more broad screener, such as a school climate survey, once the results are received and you get that data back from your student population, a really great tool for following up to pick evidence-based practices after that broad brush stroke assessment is to do focus groups with your kids to really make sure what came back on that broad survey is actually reflective of the needs within the school. But for those Tier 3 level services that give you that student level data, to really pick and choose what student might be in crisis, what student might need a higher level of intervention, those are going to be your mental health screenings and assessments. So like I mentioned before, HIPAA and FERPA is always at the forefront of everyone's mind when we talk about best practice for mental health MTSS, but they shouldn't be seen as insurmountable obstacles for school community partnerships. So long as we're clear about what information can and cannot be shared, and we are securing parental consent for communicating with our mental health partners in the community, then we are good. We need to have a release of information regarding what information can be shared. It's also a really great practice for administrators to have policy and procedure in place that they can reference regarding when a HIPAA FERPA consent might need to be signed. And again, like I mentioned, always having a policy in place for how we would share information with our community partners. So here's some different examples of ways you can collect data in schools for mental health MTSS. The school climate survey, secondary and elementary, those are both available to you for free. That's going to give you that overarching 360-degree view of what's going on in your school. Another great example is the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. That'll give you more student level data. And then there's also a school climate survey for staff, because we can't ignore the fact that if we're not well, we can't help our students be well. So while we're looking at putting in comprehensive mental health programming for students, we also need to make sure that we're taking care of our educators, because our educators can't practice co-regulation, they can't model healthy coping if they're not well themselves. So we always also need to talk about mental health MTSS with an equity lens. So MTSS in regards to cultural responsiveness is responsive to the specific cultural values, beliefs, and behaviors of family and communities. We need to ensure access to mental health supports and services in a manner that is equitable and reduces disparities across all students. Also keeping in mind that different cultures have different help-seeking behaviors, and to be respectful of those when we are planning interventions for our students. So we need to, again, keep in mind the mental health and well-being of all students, really honing in on that tier 1 to hit all kids. We need to have guidance to various student subgroups and diverse and culturally competent faculty and staff. We can engage in national and international equity issues and events and provide accessible and safe communication, as well as effective response systems to individuals with all language backgrounds. And then we can also take our key data points and disaggregate them to see if a specific population of students might be struggling with a specific mental health concern, and really tailoring our interventions to meet them where they're at. Okay. I'm going to pause right here and see if I have any more questions in the chat box before I move on to teaming. All good? Okay. So teaming is one of the most important components of a mental health MTSS. And when we think about mental health teaming within a school, think about it in context of what are teams that are already established within your schools, and how can we draw on current teams to focus on mental health MTSS. You might already have a PBIS group or an RTI group or a Safe and Healthy Schools Committee or a school climate team. All of these teams have representation from individuals that would need to be on a mental health MTSS team. So really looking at what's our team makeup and how can we get some overlap to not have to create a brand new team, really creates that systemic implementation of mental health MTSS. I will mention, though, when I talk about teaming, that leadership representation is extremely important. When it comes to mental health MTSS, again, it has to be systemic implementation from top down. It has to be seen as a priority from the leaders in the district. So having representation at mental health MTSS meetings is extremely important when it comes to creating staff buy-in for something that we know in several areas of our state has a high rate of stigma attached to it. So some different functions of mental health teams at the school level: awareness of school mental health needs and resources, implementing district school mental health policies and practices, informing and participating in training in TA in the district as needed, aligning student services using a data-driven process, and fostering those school partnerships with community leaders and family members. At the district level, it shapes district guidelines and standards of school mental health policy and procedure, training, coaching, and supporting those site level school teams. And they can liaise between state agencies and schools, fostering school partnerships with community leaders and family members. So I will mention here again that we do provide a ton of technical assistance regarding mental health MTSS out of our Office of Student Support. So if this is something that you're wanting to institute or advocate for, please don't hesitate to reach out for us. We really don't want you to have to reinvent the wheel when we've built a lot of it already. So if this does seem daunting, which it is quite a bit of information, we are happy to walk the process with you. So some different quality indicators of teaming. So once you have that teaming structure in place, really looking at our groups and saying, is this a true multidisciplinary team? Are different groups represented and at the table, including parent voice, student voice? That's where the importance of those focus groups come in. Again, that youth and family partnership, community partnerships. We need to make sure that within our multidisciplinary teams, we're addressing all tiers of intervention, and that we have individuals at the table who are well versed in all tiers of implementation. We need to make sure that we're avoiding duplication in order to promote efficiency. We need to make sure that we're looking at best practices for our meeting structure and process, such as having a set agenda, taking notes, having different roles and responsibilities. That way we stay on task, because it's likely that your multidisciplinary team is meeting during your planning period, and you probably like to grab a drink before you go back to fourth hour as well. And then we also need to make sure that we're making data-based decisions to determine student intervention. And then best practice, again, holding regular meetings, tracking attendance and troubleshooting as needed. If somebody's not coming regularly, are they the best fit for this multidisciplinary team regarding mental health MTSS? Having a scheduling process, making sure that you have actionable items and actionable decisions, and then following up on those action items. I think all too often it's really easy for us to meet as multidisciplinary teams and have these great ideas with our thought partners because we're passionate about it. That's why we're on the team, we're the think tank, and it just kind of stays with us. And then we don't have our colleagues out there advocating for how important the work is because they've seen the results, because they're not really sure what it is we're doing. So really having that communication feedback loop between upper administration, the multidisciplinary team, and the educators who are serving the students served by the mental health MTSS is extremely important. Same thing with community considerations. We want our communities to know we're doing this work so they can plug in the holes that we might not have identified. And there might be a community resource out there we're not aware of. And then we also want to promote contact with school-based providers. That's where that HIPAA-FERPA form comes in. And then again, using referral feedback meetings and forms. So if I do refer a student to services at Tier 3, how am I making sure that they're receiving those services? How am I monitoring their progress towards goals and those types of things, which can be a little more difficult in terms of mental health as opposed to monitoring the success of an academic intervention. And
excuse me, just for clarification, are you going to be providing links to some of the things you've been discussing, examples for community partners, parents, agencies, agreements, those kinds of things?
So I don't have links to MOUs in the presentation, but those are definitely things we have at the State Department that we can provide. As far as the parents and students, I'm not quite sure I understand that piece of the question.
I think they're just wanting resources. So I think the best thing to do is if you have questions is to email Beth, and I'll drop her email address in the chat, and you can email her your specific questions and resources you'd like to have.
Yeah, and hang on for just a second because I have tons of resources coming up. Yeah, it might be in there. I do want to pause and take a minute to let you guys know about an exciting thing that we're developing at the State Department. It's the Asset Map web-based tool. And so what we're developing in partnership with the Department of Mental Health is a web-based tool that will walk districts through the 4 stages of implementation of an interconnected systems framework. So that behavior and the mental health piece. For purposes of the asset map and the web-based tool, right now we're really honing in on the mental health piece. So an administrator or educator will go to this web-based tool and be able to click on their county or their town, and it will automatically populate all school-based interventions at every tier that are available to them and how to secure them, as well as monitor their progress within the 4 stages of implementation. So be on the lookout for that. It's something that we've never had in Oklahoma, and it will really streamline the process for those who are not only trying to institute mental health MTSS, but who might also just be looking for resources for themselves or family and friends. It'll be a really great one-stop shop for school-based mental health services. Okay. So why conduct a needs assessment, and what is a needs assessment? So the needs assessment allows us to identify and address different mental health needs that are the most pressing. So where does our focus need to be right off the gate when we're just now starting to institute a mental health MTSS? We need to understand how well our existing services and supports are working to meet mental health needs of students and where the gaps are. And then how can we leverage our specific systems strengths? It's easy in going through a needs assessment to be kind of blindsided by the data of how many of our students seem to be struggling, but we always have to pull on our specific services strengths and build from there. The SHAPE system I've listed here, it's a great resource. You can sign up for SHAPE as a district or site level. And what it does is it walks you through, it's a pretty extensive questionnaire, but what it does is it walks you through a series of questions asking about what current supports are available regarding mental health in your district or school. And then it sends you a report of the gaps and where the best place to focus is. So the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center has worked with the comprehensive school-based mental health curriculum developers at Safe Supportive Schools in the U.S. Department of Ed to provide this resource at no cost. So I would highly suggest the SHAPE system. And the SHAPE system also has several other resources I'll talk about here in just a minute. The SHAPE screening library and needs assessment library. I'm pretty sure we had a question earlier about this. So the SHAPE screening library is fabulous. When you go into the SHAPE screening library, if you have a specific screener that you're looking for or a screener that really hones in on a specific issue, SHAPE will have it for you at either low to no cost. So if you're looking for those evidence-based screeners that have examples of the evidence that show that they're an EBP, SHAPE is your place. Same thing with needs assessments. These are the screeners that you're going to be giving to students for both school climate or for Tier 3 services. They're all right there for you for free or low cost. Any evidence-based screener or needs assessment is going to be in the SHAPE library. Okay. And then resource mapping. I talked to you a little bit about the asset map and what we're doing as a state level to conduct resource mapping, but as a district or site level, resource mapping can also be extremely valuable. So it's an active process to identify, visually represent, and share information about internal and external supports and services that informs effective utilization of assets or the services being provided within the school. This is how we know what's available to our community at every tier of support. So some things we need to think about before we begin resource mapping as that multidisciplinary team are what kinds of services and resources do we want to map? Are they available in the school building, or are we looking for within the school building and at the community level? And what are our inclusion criteria? Do we want them to be in a specific neighborhood, community? Do we want them to be district, state, or national resources? How far do we want them to be from school? Considerations like that. So some best practice for resource mapping is we need to pair our assessment data with the resource map to consider how needs can be met with existing services and supports. Because just because we're new to the work of instituting a mental health MTSS doesn't mean that we haven't been doing things regarding mental health at each tier of intervention. It just means that we are now structuring it in a way that makes sense to where we can actually identify our gaps and our strengths and build upon those strengths, reduce those gaps. So again, it'll really help you target those areas of overlap and misalignment. And this also can lead to a higher return on investment regarding mental health supports for students. If I'm doing a social and emotional learning lesson in social studies, and it's from a curriculum that my district has purchased, but I'm not seeing any results, maybe it's time to go back to the drawing board and see if there's a different SEL curriculum that I could use, or I could look to the State Department to institute training on the social and emotional learning competencies that are coming out later this fall. So again, there are tons of resources at every level of intervention that are available to schools for free. Okay, so now moving more into screening. So screening really is your first step besides teaming and supporting a multi-tiered system of supports. It informs our prevention and early intervention strategies, as well as our Tier 3 strategies for crisis. It also identifies concerns that could be disaggregated to specific grades, classrooms, or teachers. And it also can help identify our students who have the highest amount of well-being. One of the really cool things we found is that students that have a high sense of mental well-being or a high sense of hope actually have the ability to increase the hope scores of their peers. So when we think about how we group students within the classroom for group work projects, us as educators know which of our students have really high levels of hope and which of our students might not have such high levels of hope. So really being mindful of how we group students can actually raise the hope scores and well-being scores of our kids. And then it can also help us to identify students who might be at risk for subsequent mental illness or harm to self or others. And as we all know, from sitting through the first part of this presentation, it ultimately improves access to mental health outcomes and supports for students. So matching students to appropriate interventions is probably one of the things I hear the most that gives educators anxiety. Like, how do I know that I am giving Johnny exactly what he needs? Because if I'm giving Johnny something he doesn't need, it might end up making Johnny's outcomes be worse. So this is why it's really important to use multiple data sources to match our mental health interventions with our students' needs. And again, utilizing that SHAPE screener library to make sure that we are using a screening assessment tool that's not only appropriate to our population, but that is evidence-based. And then also using that data to triage our students into different levels of support. And again, I mentioned the strengths and difficulties questionnaire here. It is a great comprehensive tool. I used it as a school counselor, and I was able to give it to all of my sixth graders and really group them into those areas of need. And then I was able to do a post-test with them for an SDQ again after different interventions were administered, and really figure out what I need to keep, what I need to change, to really help make sure that those individualized student needs were being met. So some best practice when we're talking about screening, I feel like I could make this whole slide just say do no harm, really big. But really, ultimately, we want to make sure that our screening process does not do harm to students. Kids are tested and screened pretty regularly within our school system. So we want to make sure that our screening isn't triggering to students. We want to make sure that we're rolling those efforts out gradually, that we've secured parental consent, albeit even if it's a passive consent. And then we want to make sure that we have our plan and procedure in place for what we're going to do with the data once we get it. So it's a really good idea to already have it met as a multidisciplinary team, to be thinking about what information did we get back on our resource map regarding what services we can put into place for students based on what has come back regarding their highest areas of need in our screening. So basic action steps: build your foundation, clarify your goals. Why am I wanting to do this screening? Identifying your resources and logistics. How am I going to roll out the screening? How am I going to secure parent consent? Do I need school board approval? What's the long game for screening? Do we want to make our district have a policy and procedure in place for doing this on a specific time rotation to make sure we're getting that accurate data back? So again, there's a link to the SHAPE screening library as well as the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. It's a really great place to start as just beginning. Okay, so focusing on tier 1, those universal supports for all students, we really want to make sure that we are giving our tier 1 interventions in a way that reaches our students. I know during COVID, it was really hard to figure out how do we structure interventions for virtual, in-person, blended, hybrid. So it's really important to think about, now that we're moving back into in-person, but still have several students staying virtual, how can we adapt this evidence-based practice to the virtual environment? And in doing so, are we losing the evidence base if this is something we're wanting to use for both groups of students, maybe we need to think about a different evidence-based program. And I will plug Sanford Harmony right here. Social and emotional learning is a fabulous tier 1 intervention available to all students. And I have Sanford Harmony linked on the resource page at the end of this presentation, but I'll just give it a shameless plug right here. It's an evidence-based SEL curriculum, and they have adapted it to in-person and virtual learning, and it's available for free. So that's a great resource, and that link is available at the end of my presentation. So we always want to make sure that we have a plan to track the implementation of the core components of our evidence-based practice. And then we also want to monitor those adaptations to our evidence-based practice to make sure that we're still implementing it as the creators intended. Because if we make any small tweaks to an evidence-based practice, it might be changing the evidence base of it. So again, really picking that program that meets the needs of your students without a whole lot of modifications. And then we also want to ensure that quantitative and qualitative data are obtained prior to administering the EBP as well as after in order to monitor fidelity adherence. Okay, we have already talked about this, but I will point out Maslow before Bloom. Several of you have probably already heard this, but we really need to make sure that students' basic needs are met before they can learn. Students have to be able to feel safe and secure in order to take on new information. So really focusing on that early prevention and health promotion model within our classrooms and our buildings can set students up for not only greater academic outcomes, but more future life success. So mental health promotion in schools, again, at that tier 1, promotes the well-being and educational success of all students. It's really that foundation for tier 2 and 3 mental health services and supports. And it produces huge cost savings by investing in mental health promotion and early intervention versus treatment. It's that whole moving upstream. We want to move upstream to get kids before they fall in the river and need extensive supports in order to be pulled out. Or on top of that, do we need to move even further up the river and figure out how they're getting in? How are they falling in the first place? And then we can really help to lower those numbers of students needing that high level of intervention, such as mental health treatment or crisis intervention. One of the big things we can do at this level is decrease stigma around mental health and mental illness. A really great tool for this is youth mental health first aid. I feel like I've found a lot of the times it's not that an educator doesn't want to help students with mental health concerns, but they just might not necessarily have the language or the tools to feel comfortable having those conversations. So Youth Mental Health First Aid is a great no-cost program available to all schools in the state to give educators those tools. And I can provide more information regarding that if you email me, but that service is through the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. We want to make sure that we're promoting school staff well-being, again, going back to the power of co-regulation, as I mentioned before, and seeing mental health as a part of overall health. So our kids have to be healthy enough to learn, but our teachers also have to be healthy enough to teach. And that doesn't only mean, did you eat a healthy breakfast and not drink 6 cups of coffee? It means, how are you functioning mentally right now, and how well are you coping with stressors, and what are you bringing to your relationships with kids in order to really help them when they're met with stress as well. Okay, social and emotional learning is the love language of tier 1 because it has a positive impact on all students and all teachers, and it doesn't have to be a set curriculum. That's really the cool thing about SEL, is it can be taught during core content instruction, and you're still teaching those Oklahoma academic standards, but also teaching social and emotional learning at the same time. So the State Department is coming out with SEL competencies later this fall. If you have the chance to go to Blair Harrison and Jenna Jones' presentation, if it hasn't happened yet, I would highly recommend that. And they will be talking about the competencies as well as the power of school climate and SEL. But the social and emotional learning competencies will show teachers how to implement SEL during that core content instruction. So it's not one more thing, but you're delivering your academic instruction while also giving students protective factors that will help lower future mental health concerns. So again, SEL is prevention, and it has a noteworthy return on investment. In teaching social and emotional learning, we're also furthering our own social and emotional learning. I'd be remiss to say that I think anybody made it out of the pandemic the same as they were before. So really practicing our own SEL before expecting it of our students is a really great place to start. Okay, so some best practice for school climate. We need to make sure we have that core school climate planning team, and this can be the same as that multidisciplinary team for mental health MTSS. Again, aligning with other school improvement efforts and ensuring our data are being used to select different priority areas. Okay. And I apologize, you guys, something just blew up my nose. So mental health literacy. This is, again, I mentioned youth mental health first aid. Mental health literacy goes a really long way for helping educators to feel equipped with the tools they need to support students on their mental health journey. So it has 4 integrated components: obtaining and maintaining positive mental health, understanding mental disorders and their treatments, decreasing stigma, and enhancing help-seeking efficacy. So if I know I need help, am I trying to seek that help in a way that is appropriate, or am I seeking that help in a way that might be a risky behavior or something that could potentially cause me harm? So again, that youth mental health first aid is a great tool for advancing mental health literacy with staff. Okay, so here are some great school climate and SEL resources. The ones on the top were curated from the State Department, but again, there's Teach Kindness, Overcoming Obstacles there at the bottom. Those are some different SEL curriculums. Overcoming Obstacles, I feel like, was my golden goose when I found it for the first time. It's fabulous and goes a long way towards restorative practices. So if I have a student that has had a misbehavior and I'm wanting to teach them new patterns of behavior, I can go to Overcoming Obstacles and say, type in, this kid threw a pencil during lunch duty or during lunch and it started a food fight. So I can go into Overcoming Obstacles and say exactly what the misbehavior was, and it will populate different social and emotional learning activities that I can do with the student to learn better patterns of behavior. And this is something you can do with a student if they're in school suspension. It takes about 10 minutes. Maybe they're in your classroom for in school suspension, as opposed to just reading a book or working on homework. Putting in a lesson from Overcoming Obstacles is just a little tiny nugget of what could be done to enhance restorative practices, which are a huge component of mental health MTSS. Okay. So the National Center on Safe Supportive Learning also has several resources regarding school climate and Tier 1. They have an entire resource package with a quick guide regarding everything I've talked about for Tier 1, different action guides for stages of implementation. They have modules that you can walk through as self-guided lessons or as a district, and also different assessments. So that's another really great place to start. It's completely free. And the National Center on Safe Supportive Learning Environments also has a fabulous evidence-based trauma-informed curriculum that's free and aligns to mental health MTSS. Okay, so some more options. These are more specific to Oklahoma, but some different options for Tier 1 programming. If you are looking at instituting a mental health MTSS, Good Behavior Game is for kindergarten to second graders. That's a really great Tier 1 support for classroom management. You can look at the Castle Promising Practices guides to find evidence-based SEL curriculum. Trisha will talk later about Prepare, but there's also Alcohol EDU. That would be if your needs assessment came back as students are expressing they need some substance abuse prevention, or that substance abuse is a big problem in their area or in your local area. That's a great tier 1 solution, as well as Botvin's life skills, and there's youth mental health first aid. And all of these are available at no cost to Oklahoma schools through the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, with the exception of Prepare, that is available through us. And we will talk about that here in just a little bit. And the SEL competencies I mentioned, they're not on there yet because they're not done yet, but they will be soon. Okay, and that brings us into tier 2. Tier 2 to me is one of the hardest ones to explain because it's that gray area. It's that in between. It's the one that kids are constantly moving in and out of, fluidly in and out of. So when you think about tier 2, it's an intervention that not everybody gets, like at tier 1, those universal interventions, but only some students get, but it can still happen within the classroom. One of the big ones that I coach teachers on are called neurofeedback activities. Those are really great tier 2 interventions that specifically work for your dysregulated kids without singling them out in front of their peers. And I can provide more information on that as well. It's not a heavy focus of this presentation. I'm looking at my time. So tier 2, targeted interventions, small group settings with a counselor, they tend to be on that rapid response basis and require a little less planning than your tier 3 interventions. So some different quality indicators of tier 2 services. We want to make sure that we're providing access to the specific needed services and supports. We want to ensure that they are adequate and that we have specific resources for implementation. And we're not just saying, hey, here's a new intervention that'll work at tier 2. Good luck. We want to make sure that we're monitoring the implementation and we're really getting those outcomes that we set out to achieve for our students. And we also want to make sure that we're implementing a systematic protocol for emotional and behavioral crisis response. This is something that's great to do at tier 1, so we don't get to tier 3, as Trish is going to talk about here in just a little bit. So some other questions you can ask as a multidisciplinary team analyzing your tier 2 services. So of our kids who were identified as needing mental health early intervention, how many actually got them? And in order to do this, we can use our assessment, screening, referral data, teaming processes. When I was at middle school here in Norman, we were early in the process of doing a mental health MTSS, I think without even realizing it, through our PBIS work. But that was one of the things we did as we met as a multidisciplinary team. You have those very high needs students at tier 3. And with all of the services that they're being provided, it's really hard to track where they're at in the process, what progress are they making. So we had a toolkit for each kid, like this is SE's binder. Okay, I'm gonna open SE's binder, it's Monday, this is the intervention they're receiving. Who's in charge of implementing it? Who's in charge of monitoring it? And then how do we disseminate that information back down to SE's teachers so they know what's being effective, right? Because students can receive those tier 2 and tier 3 services with their counselor or with a mental health professional. But in doing so, the tools that they're learning work for them. How are we making sure that their teachers also know that those are the tools that work for them? So that communication feedback loop is really important. It's great for me as the counselor to know what works for SE when they come to my office dysregulated, but maybe if I was coaching my teachers on what works for them, they would never have to make it to my office in this instructional time. And a lot of that, again, is that community partner importance of working with those mental health professionals to know what they're coaching students on. Okay, so here are some examples of tier 2 supports. Check and Connect. I'm sure you guys have heard of Check In, Check Out. Class pass and breaks are better. We can use differential reinforcement strategies as well as self-monitoring strategies. So one of the things that I talk about here on tier 2 is if you have students who typically are dysregulated after a unstructured activity. So maybe they're coming in from recess, or maybe they just took a test. You can have them clock their heart rate, and then maybe you're in math or science, you can have them graph that heart rate. Then we can do some coping strategies or class-wide SEL activities. Watch that stress level come down and then have them track their heart rate again. And doing that over time, they can start to recognize, these are my triggering events. These are the strategies that work for me. And they're also learning graphing. So here's some more examples of tier 2. I'm going to try and start talking a little bit faster because I don't want Trisha to be short on time. But these are some other really great interventions at tier 2. And then tier 3, I'll talk about just briefly, and then it will move into Trisha's part. So tier 3 services, those are our individualized interventions to meet the needs of kids who need more support than tier 1 and 2 alone. So while they're receiving tier 3 services, they're also receiving those tier 1 services that all of their peers are receiving, as well as the tier 2 supports that are deemed to still be relevant once they're at tier 3. So these are specifically designed and individualized interventions for your most at-risk students. These happen outside of the classroom and should always be overseen by a school-based mental health professional or an outside provider. When we talk about mental health MTSS, the referral pathways tend to be a big lift for districts. So we want to make sure that we have clear referral processes to outside mental health services. And that can be daunting based on what our own specific policies and procedures are versus what are the specific policies and procedures at my community mental health center. So really making sure that services are available, having a warm handoff, having different referral instructions and contact information for mental health providers within your community. That asset map will be extremely valuable to districts there. And also having those follow-up meetings with the provider for ongoing communication. You might be sitting in this session right now thinking, oh, this is very counselor-y, this is something the counselor should do. But really the power in mental health MTSS is that systemic implementation as well as ongoing communication. I mentioned making sure that everybody knows what works for kids is important, but also making sure that everybody knows kind of where our students are at and what they're needing help with. So granted, with confidentiality in mind. So it really is a whole district or whole site initiative. We have discussed these things. So again, community partnerships are extremely important and leveraging them is even more important. So community health and mental health services providers are different policymakers, funders. We know that SEL and mental health are a top priority right now, not just for us as schools, but for our policymakers as well. But we need to make sure that people know best practice regarding mental health and what needs to be put into policy. So if we're doing it well at our sites, making sure people know what's working is really beneficial. So we can do that through different advisory groups, different communications, evaluating our programs and communicating the results is huge. Okay. And then here's an example of an mental health MTSS. So I'm going to leave it on this slide just for a little bit, but if you look, you'll see that each tier of intervention has mental health or behavior specific interventions within it. So if you're familiar with academic MTSS, you can see how the philosophy is the same. It's just your services and supports as well as your screening modality might be different. We already talked about implementing evidence-based practice. Here are some different menus of intervention at tier 3. So CBITS is cognitive behavior interventions for students who've experienced trauma. Sparks is also a great small group evidence-based practice at tier 3. And then some different classroom interventions that can be used throughout all 3 tiers. Okay, and then here's some of our outcomes data from Project Aware. So in several of our early implementing districts, which we are in year 3, for our first Project Aware, our ODRs were reduced by 7% per 100 students, which is huge. And all of our districts from our first Project Aware grant are fully implementing mental health supports across all 3 tiers. So we are definitely poised to provide support in this area, as well as link you to your colleagues across the state who are doing this work if it's something that you would like to explore. A big component of Project Aware is parent nights and community mental health campaigns to really reduce that stigma. And in those areas where we did hold those trainings, awareness of mental health concerns and resources increased by up to 29% in all of our districts. Okay, here's some more resources for you. The IES What Works Clearinghouse, that's where you can go and find some different evidence-based practices. Model Programs Guide will kind of show you what constitutes a model program or an evidence-based practice. And then our school mental health teaming playbook, that is for assistance in really focusing on those teaming structures. And with that, I will hand it over to Trisha, and then I think we'll probably field all questions at the end. Take it away, Trisha.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Okay, so she did a great job of talking about what MTSS looks like, how to kind of set it up with that collaboration piece, making sure it's culturally responsive and sensitive, making sure that you're using teaming and collaboration. And so all of those same principles, along with some others, is how you want to address your crisis response. And it can be looked at and viewed through that MTSS lens as well. And so here, just like with academic behavior and social-emotional MTSS, you can add crisis MTSS to that and really look at it not just as a triangle, but maybe as a 3D pyramid triangle where there's different sides to it, and it all kind of goes together to make this interconnected systems framework and to really support your whole child. And so one size does not fit all. And this applies to, those academic behavior and social emotional pieces as well, is that you want to tier those levels of support. On the slide, you can see the triangle for crisis response MTSS. This resource, along with all the other resources or most of the other resources that I'm going to provide and talk about, come from the Prepare Crisis Curriculum, which is from the National Association of School Psychologists. It's a evidence-based curriculum that is comprehensive for crisis management, and it was developed. It's the only nationally available training developed by educators for educators. And so those educators that created this have put in their crisis response backgrounds into this training. And so all the examples that are provided within the training are all real life examples. They take research from best practice from what was learned from Columbine and from 9/11 and other big events like that, as well as small events that happen in the classroom daily, like the classroom pet dying, or maybe a suicide attempt or something like that. So all of these can be kind of, you can look through those crises through this MTSS lens. And so let's look at this triangle for a second. You can see that the USDE crisis management 5 mission areas, if you're familiar with those, you don't have to be, because they are in bubbles all the way around this triangle. So those are prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And so you can see that those core mission areas surround that MTSS model, and you have you have interventions and levels of support at the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 levels. Now, then you can think about your teaming and your collaboration efforts, and you'll want to have safety teams and crisis teams, and they do 2 separate roles, but they overlap a lot. And you can see on the same graphic kind of where those people fall and what kind of responsibilities they may have. And then, as always, throughout this whole crisis management piece, you are implementing these supports before, during, and after a crisis event. Occurs.
Hey, Trisha, if you can hear me, you're freezing. I don't know if it may be better to take you off video so everyone can hear. You froze for a little bit.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me try this. Okay, I am off video. Does that help with my connection?
Yes, much better, Trisha.
Okay, I apologize for that. I did not know I was buffering. So I will just stay off video so that you guys can hear me more clearly. I covered this slide. I don't know, Beth or Shelly, who's managing, but I can go to the next slide.
Yeah, I think you're good. We heard most of it, Trisha.
Okay. Next slide, please. Awesome. Okay. So you can use, again, we talked about those foundational principles of MTSS and how we can use those to evaluate our system, identify those students and staff needs, and provide interventions to match those needs. And that's accomplished by these 5 main areas. And Beth already mentioned them, so I'll go through them pretty quickly. But first one is the universal screening. And when we talk about crises, we talk about triaging, and that triage is that screening. So there's initial triage, and then there's secondary triage. So your triage, you're universally screening your kids and triaging what those needs are initially, but then you're continuously going through and triaging as those supports are provided to make sure that those individuals and groups are getting the services they need at the levels that they need them at. Again, we've talked about tiered systems of support, making sure that it's tiered and that some people may need more support than others. Using empirical based interventions, which I'll talk about a few of those later in my slides. You want to be progress monitoring your students through this. So again, just like academic and behavioral MTSS, you want to be providing or progress monitoring to determine where to go from that intervention. Do they need to stay at a tier 2 level and be provided ongoing supports, or are there more intensive supports that they need or less intensive? And then you just want to make sure that those decisions to change are based on data. Next slide, please. Okay. So why do we use MTSS approach to crisis response? And really, I bolded the middle part, and I'm going to talk about that one first, and then we'll go back to the first one. But recovery is the norm. So, and that's why it's really important to use an MTSS model, because sometimes because most of the time, recovery from a crisis event is the norm, and we want to appropriately identify because of that, because what it does is it does no harm. And so not all individuals will be equally affected. So crisis response or crises elicit emotional reactions from people based on their perception of that event. And so what we know is that for most people, recovery is the norm. They may need just a tier 1 level of support, which I'll talk about what that looks like in a little bit, and that there are going to be selected individuals or groups of individuals that may need higher levels. Not everyone exposed to trauma either wants or needs professional help. So we know that there are some groups and cultures that may not feel comfortable talking to a mental health professional. And so we want to be sensitive to that and maybe offer support, but not push that support. And that's really important. Crisis intervention should be offered in response to a demonstrated need. So again, we're not going to do harm. We're not going to assume that everyone is affected the same, or that everyone is affected and needs therapy or intervention. We want to provide those interventions based on a demonstrated need. And then also crisis intervention, again, we don't want it to cause harm. And if we do provide some of those interventions, if they're not needed, then it could cause harm. And a good example of that is if you've got an individual struggling, on an assignment in class, and you go over and they're struggling, but they're getting through it. And then you stop them and say, oh, here, let me help you with that. Some individuals probably were at that point where they needed your help. But others were struggling, but still getting through. And so what you telling them, what you stopping them and is telling them that is that they can't do it on their own. And you know that some of those kids are like, well, I'm fine, I can do it on my own, right? And so we don't want to just intervene when it's not needed. And that's kind of just an academic example of that. And that same thing goes for crisis response. Next slide. Okay, so what does that triaging look like? And what does just overall crisis kind of management look like a little bit from the response lens? And again, this graphic is also from the Prepare Crisis Curriculum, which goes in depth into all of these things I'm talking about. But it's connecting the crisis event with the evaluation of psychological trauma, which again is triage. So keep that term in mind, triage. And then determining what their risk levels are and those interventions that are that match that risk. So you start off with a crisis event and it occurs. And so you want to first go through that Maslow's hierarchy. So you want to make sure that their health and welfare is reaffirmed. They have their basic needs met, basically. And then you want to make sure that their perceptions of safety and security are there. They believe they are safe and that the physical environment is helping to ensure that they feel that way. And then from there, you're going to start your triage. And where you triage is that evaluate psychological trauma piece. And that you can triage them into 3 different areas: the low risk, the moderate risk, and high risk. And again, if you want to look at it through the triangle model, it's that tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And then from there, there's those interventions. And we'll talk about them in a few slides. But I want to highlight a little bit is where those arrows, there's an arrow that goes from the very bottom 3 boxes up back into that evaluate psychological trauma. And I want to highlight that little arrow is because that's that secondary triage piece that is often missed when responding to a crisis event, is that you triage initially, but then you have secondary triaging going on throughout, being provided those interventions to make sure that your students are still continuing to get these services and supports they need based on time. Next slide. Another way of looking at that little graphic is through this lens. And so again, most individuals respond well to that tier 1 level of support and may not need higher levels of support. I like this view of crisis response because of this little area on the right side of the screen. So that you can see that in the bottom, it says the crisis occurs, right? And it's a little star. And all along the edge, you kind of have to tilt your head to read it, but you see that the tier 1 supports are really during or immediately after a crisis. Those are typically when those interventions are provided. And then it gets into tier 2 where you have days to a week post-crisis. And the reason for that is really that's going to require more time, energy, and resources. And so you may need some time to plan for those things, to make sure that you have the appropriate groups, that those groups are cohesive and work well together. And then you see that it goes into tier 3 where it's a week to or more post-crisis. And so that's going to be even more intensive supports. And again, you might need some time, money, resources to get to that place. So that's where it typically occurs. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't provide tier 2 and tier 3 services very quickly after a crisis event. It just means that that in general, that's when those interventions would be provided based on the need for time and to organize those types of interventions. Next slide. Okay, so let's look at those tiers level of support. So the tier 1, this is supports for, and they're provided to all that are judged to have some risk of psychological trauma. So maybe they were physically proximate to the crisis event, or they have an emotional tie to that crisis event because it happened to their sibling, or it happened to a friend, or they actually were impacted by it. Those are kind of those, that risk, some of those risk factors. But overall, you're going to have that universal SEL instruction that is going to help support a crisis, an MTSS crisis management model. And so you'll see that on all of these slides, SEL instruction is really key because these can be implemented within that. So your tier 1 supports start with your social support. So making sure people have their people, making sure that they reunify with their family members and with their friends and with their teachers and get back to some normal routines. The students and staff are able to get back to their normal environments and routines as much as possible. Obviously, some crises impact large schools or communities, and it may be difficult to get back to that routine, but as much as possible, trying to get to those routines or having some kind of structure that is more normal, and that's going to help people feel more safe.
Ouch. Ouchie.
Thank you for muting.
And then the last one is you want to empower those caregivers and teachers to make decisions and connect with people, school-based mental health professionals, or those trained in best practice crisis response. And so you're going to help empower those educators and those parents to be able to help support their child or their students. And that's going to be part of that tier 1 support. Next slide. This is also a tier 1. So you want to do some psychological education, and that term psychological is kind of scary. So if you want to focus on the education piece, that's okay. Just know that this piece, these supports are really rooted in educating those people impacted on what actually happened. And so you can do that through informational documentation, letters going out, common crisis reaction handouts, things like that. Caregiver trainings, which you can also categorize as like staff meetings, are ways that you can help teachers, that teachers can help to recognize signs of distress within themselves and their students. So getting them some tools to be able to help in that crisis response piece. And then classroom meetings. And these classroom meetings are not debriefing meetings. They're really just based, they are geared toward making sure that the students that were impacted and that have cognitive mastery over the crisis facts, and that any dispelling of rumors occurs during this meeting. So obviously with social media, many rumors get out there. And so that's what that classroom meeting would do. And the caregiver training for staff too, is make sure that those people impacted have the crisis facts as we know them, and they're confirmed and accurate. Next slide. Then you get into tier 2 supports. And these are supports that are provided to those that are maybe moderately or severely traumatized. These are going to be provided by trained professionals in crisis response. And so just keep that in mind. And again, Prepare is a evidence-based crisis curriculum that we can provide through the State Department if this is something that you would like to have for your district or school. But some of those interventions that we talk about are stabilization. So, and another word for that is grounding. How can we get people that are in distress more grounded and back to, kind of reality, and so that they're dissociating, and we want to get them back to, grounding them so that they can make steps toward recovery. And then another word for that is just mental health first aid. So Beth talked about that earlier, and about those services can be very beneficial at this tier 2 level. Then you go into group crisis intervention and individual crisis intervention. And those are specific interventions that can be provided through the Prepare Crisis Curriculum. And those are just, it's a protocoled intervention that can be used for students that need tier 2 supports. And again, that SEL, that social emotional learning supports is continually going at that tier 1 level. Next slide. Then you have tier 3 supports, and these are for those individuals that really need a trained mental health professional and who may have needs long past the crisis event. And so supports like that are psychological recovery, psychotherapeutic treatments where you're actually, maybe it's outside the realm of a school-based mental health professional and you're needing to touch base with someone in the community that can provide some ongoing mental health supports. Again, you're still providing social emotional learning, and maybe you're doing some check-ins at school, but maybe it's past, they need some individualized counseling long term. And so these are some of those supports. And then these are some resources on the page. So you can call 211 and they can help you direct you to the best professional in your area. And then the QR code will take you to the APA psychologist locator, which is a very helpful tool if you're in maybe a rural area and you're trying to figure out where is a psychologist that is closest to my area. And then again, Beth mentioned the asset map will be very useful as well once it's developed and out there. Next slide. These are common resource contacts that the crisis team provides to school districts. And so if you might put these in your back pocket in case your school or district experiences a crisis event. These are some really good national hotlines and state hotlines that can help you navigate where to send individuals that need additional services, as well as just need some out of school hotlines and support. Next slide. These are some additional tools. So this QR code will take you to the NASP website, where you will find these 4 documents, which are actually from the Prepare Crisis Curriculum training. And the wonderful authors, Dr. Stephen Brock and Dr. Melissa Reeves of the Prepare Curriculum and the other co-authors of the curriculum, they felt that during COVID that these resources really needed to get out there. And so they provided some of the handouts within the training on their website for free so that people could use them given this pandemic and some of the crises that people have found themselves in. And so again, these are some free resources that you can use.
Trisha, if you're talking, we can't hear you anymore.
Use in your school. Next slide. Now?
I can hear you now. Yep, all better.
Okay. I'm so sorry, everyone involved. Internet. I'm not sure why. I think maybe the rain today, but I'm gonna try this in the next 8 minutes so that you guys have all these resources. So again, best quality crisis management contributes to all of these things. And Beth also mentioned about how mental health MTSS also contributes to these things. So I won't spend a lot of time, but it contributes to school safety. And that means not just physical safety, but psychological safety, positive school climate and culture, positive behavioral supports, emotional learning, restorative discipline, family and community engagement, and partnerships with outside agencies, and then improved academic performance. Next slide. And then all of this, I like to leave on a positive note. So especially when we talk about crisis, we need to have some positive at the end of the tunnel. So I want to end on how this type of framework really builds on resiliency and hope. And so resiliency is the ability to overcome adversity and cope in a positive and adaptive way. And so that resources are never exhausted, and that can in turn lead to toxic stress. So we want to build some resiliency. And what we know is that, people have some internal resiliency. It's just that resiliency is based on their experiences, and it's either strengthened or weakened. And so resiliency can be taught at any age, and educators can use socio-emotional learning to teach that resiliency in schools. And it doesn't have to be a separate curriculum. It can be embedded, like Beth said earlier, within your academic learning. And so it's a resiliency is unique to every person based on their strengths and weakness, the strengths and what they've had to overcome. And that when meeting students at their individual levels, it will help them to overcome that adversity. And then again, schools help to shape socially appropriate resiliency behaviors just in them being there. So all of you have missions and visions for your school, and maybe some words that you use at the beginning of the day or end of the day that help promote some resiliency. And those can be utilized to, in addition to social emotional learning, mental health, MTSS, and crisis response, to build that resiliency. Next slide. And then that building resiliency leads to hope, and it's a cognitive process and a psychological strength. So this information came from the Hope Research Center at OU. And hope is having a goal. It's seeing a pathway and basically determining if you have the mental energy and motivation that it travels down a pathway, and that in and of itself is called agency. So it's having a goal, seeing a pathway, and making sure and having agency to travel down it. Next slide. And then here are some just practical ways to help students practice and develop their hope and their resiliency. And I won't go through each one of these, but they're there on the slides, and they've been provided to you in the chat box. And then lastly, let's on building resiliency and strength-based crisis response. Again, we're going to go back to that Chinese word for crisis. And so I think they had it right when they put two symbols together to make the word crisis in the Chinese language. One of them meaning a time of danger, and the other one meaning a time for opportunity. And so yes, crisis can be scary, and it can be traumatizing and devastating, but it also is a time for opportunity, and that us as individuals can use that to build on our resiliency and really get on a path toward recovery and hope. So I love ending on that. And then now I have some resources that you can have. So I have 4 minutes, and I'm going to try to get through these so quickly. So the State Department of Education has a crisis team, and we have comprehensive school crisis management that we can assist you with. The number on the slide is the call line, the crisis call line. So if you experience a crisis event that you might need support on, you can call that line, and we will help you as best we can. And then the QR code is to our website. These are some ways that we can help. So we can do training and professional development, which includes that Prepare Crisis curriculum. We can assist with emergency operations plans, but I'd also put a plug in for the Office of Safety and Security. They do an amazing job with putting together emergency operations plans and connecting that piece, but we can assist with it as well. And then crisis response assistance or collaboration can come in the form of resource support, collaboration, in-person or virtual assistance, depending on what your need is, and then also connecting school and community supports. And our motto is as little or as much support as needed. And so we just wait for schools to tell us what they need. And we won't ever overstep our boundaries. We just want to, when we do consult with schools or districts on a specific crisis, we just ask, okay, how can we help you? How can we help you manage this crisis? And how can we help provide some support? And so again, nothing's pushed. It's all what the school feels that they need. And that's kind of why our motto is what it is. Next slide. These are some examples of that technical assistance that we can provide. We put it in the PREPARE acronym just because that's kind of the way we view it. but we can help provide that training initially, but we can also help with vulnerability assessments or risk and threat-based assessments. We can help with communication supports after a crisis event, or help with determining that mental health triage, or providing psychological first aid if needed. And then we can also come in after the crisis and do some debriefing or some after action planning to help inform your emergency operation plan for later. And so those are just some examples of what we can help provide and do for the schools. Next slide. This is an additional resource that we can that we give out. This is just kind of, if you think about a postcard, that's what this looks like. It's just a screenshot of it, but it's our call card, and it has our number and then some of the resources that we can provide. So hopefully we'll be able to get those printed and send them out to school districts, because we want all school districts to have this resource and to know that we're available to help support them. Next slide. And then this is our contact information. Oh, and I'm sorry that I think Beth's phone number got a little skewed, but we have our crisis website. And then if you would like to get continually updated on information, you can use this newsletter and add yourself to our newsletter, which provides things across the board, everything that includes counseling and school-based mental health integration. Anything that falls in that realm is on this newsletter. So, and then again, the crisis line is a good resource. Next slide. Okay, and then there's our resources. And I think there's, and we are at time. Beth, do you have any last words?
This is Shelley. There was just one question in the chat earlier that asked if we had an estimated time on when the asset map would be available.
Yes, so we are finishing the RFP process with our vendor now, and it is a 3-year project. Year 1 being community analysis of the state of Oklahoma. Year 2 would be putting it into the beta website, and then year 3 would be launch with focus groups, field feedback, and tweaking of the site based on the feedback we've received from focus groups and initial end users. So work is starting now. Final project would be school year 23-24. But just know that the work is happening with our vendor regarding mapping this state before the web tool is live. And then I'll hang out just for a little bit in case anybody else had a question that didn't make it into the chat. Shelley, is what you just shared the PD form? Or do I need to pop that in? I'm not quite sure what that link is.
I think it is. I was checking to make sure. Yes, that's what it was.
Okay, thank you for doing that. All right, and as Shelley mentioned, and Trisha, if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Trisha or anyone in our Office of Student Support. We have grown exponentially over the last several years, and we get to live in the fun gray area of only supporting kids' well-being, and we just love what we do and resourcing our schools. So if there's something that we don't have that you see as beneficial, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. That's how we know what to do. So it's great to see all of your names in black boxes on my screen, with the exception of Melody. Thank you for turning your camera on. And I hope you guys all have a lovely rest of your day and summer.
Thank you all, and I apologize for all that tech issues on my end.